Hello everyone. In this recording, we're going to discuss different kinds of interactivity that you can implement within D3. There are going to be two main types of interactivity. The first is going to be interactivity that's defined by UI elements, so like buttons, drop-down menus. And then the second is going to be interactivity that's defined by interaction with graphical marks, so like hovering over a circle or selecting a line. So let's first talk about interactivity defined by UI elements. So this is going to look very similar to what you saw already in Shiny. In fact, all the different kinds of Shiny inputs are just very light wrappers of standard HTML inputs. So for example, here I'm showing a few different kinds of inputs. So here's just some text inputs, there's a button, drop-down menu, slider. So it's stuff that we saw in Shiny, but I'm implementing it directly in HTML. This code just implements these inputs. So this is a text input, here I have a button, this is defining the drop-down menu, this is defining a slider. A very similar syntax to what we've already seen before. You can define all the options, you can define the ranges. At this point, if you wanted to have some sort of recognition for every time this input is changed, there are different kinds of attributes that you can set on these tags. I haven't set them here, but you could define something like onChange, run this function. Or here, every time the slider is changed, you would do onChange, update. And that would be a function that's going to change every time the input is changed, and you could access the value of the current input. Okay. So this is just how to make a plain input element. You can modify the appearance using CSS rules. So if you don't like the appearance here, just adding some CSS, using the exact same HTML code, you can get something like this, right? So this modifies the appearance. Okay, a very common use case. Sometimes when you have a selection option, you might have more options than you want to actually type out by hand, right? You might imagine you want to select every state in the country. You're not going to want to have all the input elements for every single state and just type it out by hand. What you can do in this case is you can use a data bind. So if you have an array where the names are every single state, then by entering an option, you can enter a whole bunch of option elements associated with this input, and it's going to automatically append all those option elements without you having to type them out by hand. Right, so you can use data joins to define input elements themselves. Okay, so those are the input interactions defined by different kind of UI elements. What are interactions that you can define based on visual marks? Okay, the most common thing to do is to have an SVG graphical element. So in this case, you could have circles. And then based on some interactivity on that SVG element, you can run some function. So the kind I'm going to discuss here, different kinds of mouse inputs. So the way this works, I'll show an example. So on this one, every time I go over the circle, it's printing out this hovered statement. This one, every time I click on it, it's saying it's clicked. This one, it's getting the pixel coordinates. And this one is just printing every time I move the mouse. Notice the interactivity is a little bit different. This one, it's every time I move. This one is only when I enter. It's only printing when I go over for the first time, but not when I'm moving inside the circle. Okay, so how am I getting these SVG elements to respond to user interactions? You define these kind of on, and then the name of the type of interaction, and then the function that you want run every time that interaction happens. Right. So in this case, circle 2 is this one. And what I'm saying to do is select that circle. Every time it's clicked, run F2. What is F2? It's just logging that it's clicked. But you can imagine doing all sorts of other things. You could imagine changing the color. You could imagine changing some other plot. It's just allowing the user to do some sort of input. There are a whole bunch of events like this. So click is just one. The one where I was printing that mouse move, that is something called mouse move. So it's recognizing anytime the mouse is moved on that selection. I can access the location of the mouse by using d3.pointer. That's how I was getting the locations from this one. Right? I am calling mouse move, so every time the mouse is moved on circle 4, call this function. What this function is doing is these events have default arguments. The default argument is something called an event object, and D3 has a way of accessing the mouse coordinates from that event object. Different kinds of interaction events will have different kinds of properties. So whenever you do a mouse, you can use d3.pointer. We'll see another example in a minute with the brush. Okay, so let's just talk about brush now. So remember, this is what a brush looks like. The syntax for creating it is a little bit different. So unlike the mouse events, you have to create a brush object outside of any D3 selection. So there's a library within D3 called D3brush. You define it like this, and then the onBrush is saying every time the user moves the brush, call function f. You could actually also have it, every time the brush is stopped, right? Like, don't count this as the event, but only when I lift my mouse up, count that as an event. You could also have it when they start doing the brush. But typically we will want to do anytime the brush is moved or resized, we're going to call the function f. So this defines the brush, but on its own, the brush won't appear just by defining this variable. What you have to do is you have to define a group element, select that group element, and then write call on that D3 selection. So what I mean is, let's see if I can inspect this. Okay. So when I created this brush example, I just had a plain SVG and I defined a group, this G element. I called it with class brush, and I actually had nothing else. None of these other attributes were included. I selected that kind of plain group element of class brush, that's the dot brush. And then when I did dot call and this variable that I defined using the D3 brush library, when I use that dot call, it's automatically setting a whole bunch of attributes for this group element. So it's including these attributes, and it also binds all these other tags. And now these other tags are what is allowing me to define this brush. So that's why you need to have this dot call around these sort of brush selections. It's just more complicated than a simple hover event, but you don't have to do it manually. You just have to define this brush object and then call some group with that brush object. Okay, so that is, here's a function that's being called every single time the brush is moved. A very common thing you're going to want to do with a brush is figure out what are the pixel coordinates that define the endpoints of the brush. Here, you also rely on the fact that the event is automatically passed in to this function every time you use this .onBrush syntax. And when you're using a brush, there's always going to be an attribute called the selection. And the selection is just creating an array. So look here. It's giving the coordinates of the ends of this box. Right? So it's going to be able to help you figure out what is the minimum x, minimum y, maximum y in pixel coordinates. Usually when you have that, you're going to be able to figure out whether points lie within the brush. You're going to figure out whether maybe like a path crosses through the brush. So you could define all sorts of subsequent behavior once you know the bounds of the brush, and you can update your visualization every time this brush is moved. Okay, so that's all for input elements. No, you can do it either through the UI, and that's very much like Shiny, or you can do it through these hover, click, or brush events based on the SVG elements on the screen.